You know this feeling. You wake up in the morning, you are not sick, you are not exhausted, but you don't feel fully clear either. Your head feels a little heavy, your thinking feels a little slower, your patience is a little shorter. You still work, you still function, but something feels off. You start blaming the usual things: stress, sleep, age. But over time, a quiet question starts to appear. What if it is none of those? What if it is something you do socially and casually without thinking twice? This episode is not about alcoholism, it is not about addiction, it is about what regular, normal, and socially acceptable drinking slowly does to your brain over years. Not in dramatic ways, but quietly, in ways most people don't notice until much later. And before we go any further, let me say this clearly. I'm not a saint either. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to show you what is actually happening inside your brain with science. I'm Dinesh Kumar. This is the DK Talks. The illusion of normal drinking. Most people who drink don't think of themselves as heavy drinkers. A glass of wine with dinner, a couple of beers on the weekend, a few drinks at a social event. Nothing extreme, nothing out of control. And because everyone does it, it becomes normal. And because it is normal, it slowly becomes invisible. It stops feeling like a decision, it just feels like part of life. But here is the uncomfortable truth. For the brain, there is no amount of alcohol that comes with zero cost. Not one drink a day, not moderate drinking, not even occasional or social drinking. Every dose has a cost. At lower doses, the cost is smaller, but it is not zero. This is not a fear-mongering, and this is not a moral judgment. This is what large-scale brain imaging studies have been showing again and again for more than a decade. So the real question is not, is alcohol bad for my brain? The real question is, how much damage am I personally comfortable with? And most people are never given the information to answer that question honestly. How alcohol ages the brain? Your brain changes as you age. That is normal. Processing speed slows down, memory becomes a little less reliable, mental flexibility goes down. But alcohol accelerates this entire process. In 2022, a study published in Nature Communications analyzed brain scans from more than 36,000 adults. The results were hard to ignore. Even 1 to 2 drinks per day were associated with measurable reductions in brain volume. And the relationship was not linear, it was exponential. Going from 0 to 1 drink a day had small effect. Going from 1 to 2 had a bigger effect, but going from 2 to 3, the rate of brain aging increased rapidly. At higher level of consumption, people's brain looked years older than their actual age, sometimes close to a decade. This is not about alcoholics, this is about regular people who drink within what society calls normal. Brain shrinkage, gray and white matter. Your brain is made of two main types of tissue. Gray matter, which contains your neurons, are the cells responsible for thinking, memory, and processing. White matter, which contains the connections between those neurons, is the wiring that allows different parts of your brain to talk to each other. Alcohol damages both. Chronic drinking reduces gray matter volume, especially in areas like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for decision making, impulse control, and focus planning. The hippocampus is essential for learning and for forming new memories. When these areas slowly shrink, you don't suddenly forget who you are, you just become little less sharp, a little less slower, and a little less reliable in your thinking. White matter is affected too. Alcohol damages the myelin sheath, the protective coat around nerve fibers that allows signal to travel quickly and efficiently. When this wiring degrades, communication inside your brain slows down. You might notice it as slower recall, more mental effort to concentrate, more tip of the tongue moments, or a vague feeling that your mind is not as quick as it used to be. These changes don't arrive one morning, they accumulate years after year, drink after drink. Neuroinflammation, the silent damage. There is another layer most people never hear about: neuroinflammation. When you drink alcohol, your brain's immune cells called microglia become activated. In small, short term amounts, that is normal. That is how the brain protects itself. But with repeated exposure to alcohol, the cells stay switched on. They stay active. They start releasing inflammatory signals even where there is no real threat. So your brain slowly enters a state of low-grade chronic inflammation, not obvious but constant. Over time, this inflammation damages neurons, weakens synaptic connections, and quietly accelerates cognitive decline. You don't feel this happening. There is no pain, no clear warning sign, just a slow erosion of function that most people blame on stress or aging or being tired. But the inflammation is real and it is measurable. Cognitive effects: memory, focus, learning. Now let us talk about what this means in daily life. Alcohol interferes with how your brain consolidates memories. Even a single night of drinking can disrupt the process that moves memories from short-term storage into long-term memory. Over years of regular drinking, this effect compounds. Over time, people start to notice things like forgetting conversation, losing track of details, or having to relearn things they used to remember easily. Focus is affected too. The prefrontal cortex, already vulnerable, is responsible for sustained attention. When it is compromised, it becomes harder to concentrate for longer periods, easier to get distracted, and harder to stay with one thing for long. Learning slows down. The hippocampus, which is central to learning, is one of the brain region most sensitive to alcohol. This does not mean you cannot learn. It means learning takes more effort, and what you learn does not stick as well. If you care about mental clarity, sharp thinking, and long-term cognitive performance, these are not small costs. Emotional and personality changes. This part is harder to measure with a scan, but many people recognize it in themselves. Over a year of regular drinking, some people notice subtle changes in their emotional life: more irritability, less patience, lower tolerance for stress, and more emotional reactivity. The prefrontal cortex also plays a role in emotional regulation. As it weakens, your ability to regulate impulses and emotion goes down with it. At the same time, the amygdala, your brain's threat and fear center, becomes more reactive. Small frustrations start to feel bigger. Stress becomes harder to handle. Emotional balance becomes more fragile. This is not about being drunk. This is about the slow structural effect on the architecture of your brain. The person you became after years of drinking may be slightly different from the person you were before. Not in a way that shocks anyone overnight, but in a way that slowly becomes your new normal. I have actually seen this in my own life. For most of my life, I was not a heavy drinker at all. I always had a friction with alcohol. I would drink occasionally, maybe once or twice a year. But around 2019, something changed. Drinking slowly became more frequent. By 2020, what used to be once in a while had quietly turned into a weekend ritual. And then sometimes it spilled into the week too. It did not feel like a problem, but it just crept in. I gained a lot of weight. I went from being fit to the heaviest and most undisciplined version of myself I had ever been. And more importantly, something else started changing. I have always been someone who reads a lot, 30 or 40 books a year. When I'm not reading books, I'm reading research papers or medical journals. But slowly that started fading. My reading dropped to less than 10 books a year. I stopped reading research almost completely. My thinking felt slower, my words didn't come as easily. Even my communication started to suffer. And the scary part, none of this happened suddenly. It was a slow churn and I noticed it very late. That is when I decided to stop and I told myself something half jokingly but very serious. Workaholism is better than alcoholism. The myth of moderate drinking. For a long time, we were told that moderate drinking was fine, maybe even healthy. A glass of red wine a day is good for the heart and nothing to worry about. That story has been around for years, but here is the uncomfortable update. The science has moved on. When researchers started to looking at much larger groups of people and following them for much longer periods of time, the picture completely changed, especially for the brain. What we are finding now is simple and uncomfortable. There may be no truly safe level of alcohol for the brain. A big part of the old benefit story came from a flawed comparison. They compared moderate drinkers to non-drinkers, but many of the non-drinkers were people who had already stopped drinking because of health problems. So, of course, the moderate drinkers looked healthier. Once you take that into account, most of the protective effects simply disappears. This does not mean one drink will destroy your brain, but it does mean something important. The idea that moderate drinking is harmless is not supported by current evidence. Every drink has a cost. The cost may be small, but it is not zero. Recovery and reversibility. Now, here is the hopeful part. The brain is not fragile, it is remarkably adaptable. When people stop drinking or even significantly reduce it, something interesting begins to happen. Some of the changes start to move into the other direction. Brain volume can partially recover, inflammation can come down, and cognitive performance can improve. People often notice improvements in memory, attention, and mental speed within weeks of stopping, not years, just weeks. And the earlier you stop, the better the outcome. The younger you are and the shorter the history of heavy drinking, the more your brain can recover. But we should be honest as well. Some damage, especially after many years of heavy drinking, may not fully reverse, which leads to the real point. The brain can heal, but it heals best when you give it the chance it deserves as early as possible. Waiting until the damage is severe does not mean recovery is impossible. It just means the window is smaller. I'm not here to tell you to stop drinking. That is your choice, your life, your body. I'm just here to make sure you have the information to make that choice clearly. Most of us were never taught this. We were taught that alcohol is social, that it is normal, that it is relaxing, even sophisticated. But we were never taught what it does to the brain over 5, 10 or 20 years. Now you know a little more, not everything, but enough to start asking better questions. Enough to notice what you might have been ignoring. Enough to decide what trade-offs you are actually willing to make. This might be the clarity you needed, and clarity is the foundation of every good choice. If this episode gave you something to think about, share it with someone who might benefit from the same clarity, not to preach, just to inform. If you found this conversation valuable, consider liking the video and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. And tell me in the comments, did anything here change the way you think about alcohol? I really do read every single one. Take care. I will see you in the next one.